Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Sterling Live. My name is Caitlin Brower. I'm Sterling's Director of PR and Social Media and your host of Sterling Live. I'm really excited for today's episode because this is the first time where I have guests that are a day ahead of me. So for me right now, it is the 22nd of April. With my two amazing guests up top, it is April 23rd. So a really cool experience for me right now. I might ask you guys what the future is like, but maybe we'll get into that a little bit later in the episode. But I can't, I can't wait to introduce my guests to you. So today we have Mick Roche, Head of Sales for Sterling APAC, and Rod Crowder, Founder, Managing Director, and Principal Consultant of OpsCentre. As you can see on the bottom of our screen, this is our topic today, a very, very timely topic. We are taking a deep dive into Australia's SOCI legislation update. So Mick and Rod, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Sterling Live. I would like for both of you to take a moment to introduce yourselves to our audience and share a little bit about your roles at Sterling and OpsCentre, you know, our relationship and everything like that. So Mick, I will start with you.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. My name is Mick Roche, as you very well introduced. I have been working with Sterling almost 7 years, and my responsibility is, growing sales, particularly across the ANZ region at the moment, and leading the team and to work with clients and help them mitigate personnel risk.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. Rod, I'll kick it over to you for an introduction to our audience.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Yeah, so I'm Rod Crowder. I'm the founder and principal consultant at OpsCentre. We are basically a risk and resilience organisation, consultancy organisation. So we help organisations look at all the bad things that can go on, all the legislation, all the compliance requirements, and help them look at all of the risk exposures, build plans, implement them, and test them. So, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both again for joining me today. I did say it is a very timely topic, so I want to dive into it as soon as possible. I would like to take a moment, though, and remind our audience, if you are watching live now on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, if you have any questions for Mick or Rod throughout the episode, please go ahead and put them in the comment section across all three of these social media platforms, and I will get them over to them as I see fit throughout the episode. All right. I said I wanted to get started because we've got a lot of information to cover. So let's start with an overview. Mick, can you please explain the legislation change in Australia?
Yeah, happy to, Caitlin. Thank you. So the Security Legislation Amendment Act came into effect in April of that year, in 2022. Okay, and that builds on the original Critical Infrastructure Act of 2018. The compliance date for the new legislation is really fast approaching. We've got 4 months to go, and everyone needs to be compliant by August of this year. So the amendment introduces a number of key measures, and those key measures are: there's an obligation for responsible entities to maintain a critical risk management program, a new framework, not surprisingly, around cybersecurity for operators of systems of national significance, and then the thing that really underlines the importance of this legislation, there's a great expansion from the original 4 sectors that it covered across into 11 sectors. And I know Rod will dig into that a little bit later on. But the important thing is the amendment is sending a really clear message to people who have responsibility for these critical assets, that the risk management of these assets must be prioritized and form part of core business activities for those entities.
All right, so August 2024. So we've got some information for all of you listening right now as we quickly approach that date to where organizations need to be compliant. So Rod, I'll come to you next. So why is all this important and who exactly is impacted?
Yeah, so look, the government's, I guess a couple of reasons. The government's extended the scope of SOCI, as Mick talked about. It's also enhanced some of its enforcement measures as well, just to basically to address the complex, evolving nature, of threats and risks facing Australia's critical infrastructure. A lot of other countries have done this around the world as well. It's happening, and it's really about protecting our sovereignty and our security and our economy. What will happen basically is that this will enhance the resilience and security of all of the critical infrastructure sectors that sort of underpin all of the essential services which keeps the economy going, such as transport, financial markets, transportation, energy, etc. I mean, really simply put, it's like a massive business continuity plan for the government, if you will, yeah? Who's impacted? Look, previously there were 4 sectors. It was very narrow focused. The original legislation was all focused around electricity, around gas, around water, and around maritime ports. There are now 11 sectors, so it's really broadened out, as Mick highlighted. We've now got banking and finance, communications, data and processing, defence, education, food. Major supermarkets are actually named in the legislation, for example, health, space exploration, transport, so all areas of transport like ports and public transport and aviation and freight and water and sewage and so on. So a lot of new sectors have been brought into the fold. And I think the important thing to realise here is that a lot of these are linked, and there are some obviously dependencies across different sectors. So, for example, if you were to take the energy sector, that could have, you know, a lack of supply or a widespread failure in the energy sector could have, you know, implications on a lot of these other sectors like health and food and telecommunications, banking, finance, and so on. The other thing I'll just finish on is that not every organisation here today and watching this webinar are going to be impacted by this. So just because you're in one of these 11 sectors doesn't necessarily mean that your organisation has to comply. There are different tiers. There's what's called the critical infrastructure asset class descriptions. And so within banking and finance and within education and within health and within water supply and transport, there are different tiers of organisations. So if you're a local reseller of telecommunications and mobile phone services, you're probably not going to have to worry too much about SOCI. If you are a national telecommunications provider, for example, like we have here in Australia, Telstra and Optus and Vodafone, the really large ones, they're obviously going to fall under the legislation. If you're a local courier company delivering packages around the CBD, again, probably not going to be too concerned about SOCI, but if you're a nationwide freight organisation, shipping critical infrastructure and goods across borders and so on, then it will need to take it into consideration. So just because the sectors are listed, you know, are there, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be directly impacted.
Thank you for that. Definitely probably a lot of people listening out there being like, all right, great, I have nothing to worry about. But let's focus on those who need to comply and need further information. I want to look at the components and requirements a little bit more. So Rod, I'll actually stay with you here. What are the components of change which these organizations need to pay attention to?
Yeah, so look, the big thing really now is that there are 3 what we call PSOs, positive security obligations. Positive security obligations, meaning you've got to do something about them. That's the fundamental use of the word positive in these definitions. And this is what basically the government wants to put in place to ensure that all of these critical asset and infrastructure operators have the appropriate governance, identification, protection mechanisms, response mechanisms around all these different hazards. First of all, there's an information provision, PSO, and that basically means that organisations must register their critical assets with the federal government. So no longer you can just sort of sit back. They need to be aware of what your critical assets are, how you're managing them, what's their scope, etc., etc. And organisations must also update those asset details with the government. So, for example, if you're a wind farm operator generating renewable energy, you know, you give the government all the detail of your current assets and so on. But if you're building new wind farms or you're getting into solar or you're building battery plants or whatever it might be, then you must keep that up to date with the government. So it's very important that you give them an initial a stake in the ground in terms of what your current assets are, but also maintain that. Secondly, the second PSO is all around mandatory cyber incident breach notification. This is obviously another sort of global trend that I'm sort of mentioned previously. But if you have any sort of cyber incident, you must notify the Australian Cyber Security Centre, both via phone and website immediately, and you must also follow up in writing. So there's now a mandated obligation if you have a cyber incident to notify the regulatory authorities. And thirdly, as Mick alluded to earlier on, there's a requirement to have a risk management plan. That's called a risk management PSO, the positive security obligation. And that means that organisations must have a plan outlining how they're identifying risks, how they're dealing with hazards, how they're minimising and mitigating those different hazards and so on in a formally developed plan. And that plan basically consists of 4 key elements. There are 4 primary hazards. So unlike some areas of the world where this is very much cyber and information security driven, and that is a key component of SOCI, there are 4 key elements. There's supply chain hazards, there's cyber and information hazards, there are physical hazards and personnel hazards. And this is where the relationship between our organisations has really been driven around those risks around people and critical infrastructure and the sort of critical infrastructure that people manage within the organisation. So it's not just about cybersecurity, it's about supply chain, it's about cyber, it's about physical, and it's about personnel. So organisations need to have assessed each of those different categories of hazard, have a plan to mitigate and deal with them, and be able to respond to them if they have some sort of an incident.
I want to dive deeper into the personnel hazards, and Mick, I'll come to you. I do just quickly, for those who are viewing on LinkedIn right now, our marketing team is in the comment section with helpful information and contact information as well. Just as you're watching the episode, if you're wondering who to contact for more information, specifically with OpsCentre, there is a form fill now on LinkedIn, and Rod and his team will get back to you as soon as possible for any questions that or help that we can give you guys for sure. So I just wanted everyone on LinkedIn to be mindful that we're in the comment section. We're putting in some information in there for you, and we will throughout the episode. So yeah, personnel hazards. I did want to talk about that a little bit more. So Mick, what are the key requirements and consideration when it comes to assessing personnel hazards?
Thanks, Caitlin. Look, so like a lot of legislation, it puts a framework in place for an entity to go about assessing the risk and understanding the risk associated with their activities across these critical assets. Once this assessment gets completed, it's up to the organization themselves to put the right level of risk mitigation in place to remove that risk from their organization. And the importance of legislation, it can't be understated, and it's clearly reflected of how they've gone from 4 sectors out to 11 sectors. And the thing that really always strikes me about this legislation is I think society is quite fragile, and you don't have to look back further than the COVID pandemic. Now, I'm not sure what it was like over in the US, but here there was lots of news stories about people fighting and wrestling in supermarket aisles because they thought toilet paper was running out.
Happened here too.
Yeah, so over toilet paper. So you think about the organizations governed by this legislation and the critical component it plays in people's lives. So, for example, we look at, say, the internet going down or the mobile networks going down. And now with such a diverse and spread out people can't get hold of their loved ones or they can't contact someone. The panic that would ensue would be really quite incredible. So the risk is really real, and that's why this legislation is so important. So the personnel risk component to it, going back to your question, is a huge component because it's the people in your organization. They're the one who control the assets, who access the system, who manage defense. And that's why it's so important that an organization takes a really robust role risk approach to their employees. No 2 roles are the same in any organization, so it's important that the risk-based approach is taken and it's applied to the particular level of each role within that organization. The other thing is we move around a lot as people nowadays. Australians are great travelers, so there's a big immigration policy in Australia. Hundreds of thousands of people arrive in Australia every year, immigrants for the first time, but also there's a significant amount of Australians moving back every year. So it's really important to not only understand someone's background, but irrespective of where they've lived and worked, you need to be able to understand their history, where they've worked, and how risk can present from previous roles that they've worked in. So really, really important. There's a few misconceptions in the market about how to manage or mitigate this employee risk. So if you're doing some research, it will come up with a government organization called OpsCentre, and they're very good at helping with a standard sort of risk approach of a standard package. But as I mentioned earlier, you need to understand the full spectrum of an employee's history, where they've lived, where they've worked, so you can manage the risk in all those countries. And that's where an organization like Sterling comes in, because we have that global breadth and ability to cover it, and we also have a much deeper package of checks that we can conduct on employees, which is really important. So we're already helping a lot of clients with this legislation and helping them mitigate this employee risk. But employee risk is a very, very significant part of this legislation. Thank you.
Of course. Rod, I know you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that Mick raises, and we get asked by a lot of our clients what are the right checks that we need to undertake for our personnel, right? You know, as Mick mentioned, I know Sterling has a huge portfolio of different types of checks, and just wanted to sort of mention that that's tied back to that risk management framework that you build, and really no two organizations are the same. So if you're a bank and you're employing someone in a credit management department or a trading department, the checks that you want to carry out are probably going to be more around fraud and financial past and history and credit references and those sorts of things. If you're employing physical workers that are, electricians or whatever it might be, or plumbers or whatever it might be in different types of industries, obviously the nature of those kind of checks is going to be quite different. So I think, again, to Mick's point, it's really important that you actually tailor the checks that you require to your industry and to your organization, and tie them back to your risk management plan that you've developed at the outset.
That's a great point, Rod, and you're right. Like, there is a whole variety of different checks we can do, but I think that one of the most important things to point out is, and often overlooked in the background screening industry, identification of the person coming to work in your organization is the bedrock of any background check. So be able to identify and confirm that's the person that you're bringing into your organization is essential. And of course, the time we're in now, that has to be done digitally. You need to have the facial recognition, checking the documents back to source, liveness testing, all those really important aspects to make sure you have the right person.
Absolutely. Thank you both for that. Really, really good information there. Okay, so we already said August 2024. All right. Today and tomorrow for me, it's April 23rd, April 22nd here. Let's talk about what's next. So we have Sterling Live today, right now. We're looking towards August 2024. We went over a lot of requirements and details today, sectors, things like that. What's next? Those are my next questions are coming around around what's next. So, Mick, what does this mean for international organizations that have subsidiaries in Australia?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. So very simply, if you're an international organization and you have subsidiaries and you're controlling critical infrastructure assets over here, you're bound by the legislation. It's not complicated. It's not difficult to understand. You are bound by the legislation to the level of law. Now, if you are an organization, an international organization operating in Australia, there's a very good chance you're operating critical assets in other countries as well. Now, it won't come as a surprise that Australia is not the only country who has this similar legislation in place. So countries like the US, the UK, and Singapore do, as an example. So if they're operating in Australia, it's a very good chance that they're already operating in countries like this. So they would already most likely have a very clear risk management plan in place. So it's something that they can certainly leverage to use for Australia, but you would leverage that plan, obviously review the legislation in Australia and make the tweaks that are relevant to make sure that you're compliant.
So I'll stay with you, Mick, but I have a question for the both of you. So what is the roadmap and time frame for organizations to respond to this change? So again, I know we threw out August 2024, but more details into that time frame, into that roadmap.
Yeah, so obviously you're right. August 24, it is literally around the corner, right? I mean, I'm a bit surprised we're already in April.
I don't know how. I think I posted that this was in March on my personal LinkedIn. I'm still in March. I don't know how it's mid-April already, so, or end of April.
Look, the thing is, I mean, for any organization, I think most people governed by this legislation will already have their plans almost in place. It can be very overwhelming, and particularly, we spoke about this before, when you look at legislation, it talks about the framework and you must mitigate this risk, you must mitigate this risk. If this is not risk you've dealt with before, sometimes it's a little bit overwhelming, right? So there's lots of organizations you can work with, plenty of good background screening providers out there, plenty of experts like Rod in the market. You can always reach out and get help from different people. But the most important thing, particularly from sort of the employee risk component, is identifying all the critical workers in your organization, understanding the access to the critical infrastructure assets, and then applying the right risk-based approach. So you could have different people in the organization looking at this. So typically in background screening, it's the talent acquisition, the HR team are working on it. When you start bringing in legislation, it brings in a compliance team. So there's a number of things you can do as a compliance person when you're reviewing this legislation. You can obviously work with your HR team, who most likely already have a background screening policy in place, or you can work with an organization with us if you need some support to understand it, because we're already doing a lot of this for existing clients already. Now, there are a finite amount of checks that you can do on a personnel. But it's very important that you have the right checks in place. So there's lots of, people run to the standard criminal history, but, when you're talking about critical infrastructure, you need to be looking at adverse media, you're looking at social media, you're trying to pick up a trend or identify things that are said or put out there online that may cause concern for someone accessing critical infrastructure. So very important to understand the tools that you have in order to mitigate that risk. So when you identify those critical workers, you apply the right level of packages or the right level of risk mitigation checks to that person. It's also important, that's their point in time checks, right? People change, as we know, as we get older, usually for the better. But it's important to have ongoing screening of these people. Either you have a rescreening policy in place where you're checking people on an annual basis or a 3-year basis, depending on the risk level that you've associated that role, or even one better, a continuous monitoring program. So your employees at all time, and you get notified if anything changes for them, which really is where the background screening industry is going and should be going. But when you're talking about critical infrastructure, that is your best approach, and that's where you should be going. And then the very last part of it, which some people don't give enough consideration to, is the offboarding processes you have in place, because you have to understand that when someone leaves the organization, they have no way of ever accessing those assets again for any reason whatsoever. So it's a very important process, and it's important to check them as you offboard them, because something may have turned up if you're not doing an ongoing screening program, because you want to know, has anything been left behind?
Great.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Of course. Rod?
So look, the clock is definitely ticking. But the Australian government was very kind. As Mick mentioned, this legislation was introduced or was announced quite some time ago. It was amended in 2021 and then again in 2022. But most of the grace periods have now expired. So developing those 3 positive security obligations, the cyber incident reporting, the information provision, and the critical infrastructure risk management plan, they've now expired. So if they're not in place, I urge any organisation to go out and get them in place as soon as possible. There's another grace period related to cyber that's expiring in a few weeks, in a couple of months' time, 3 or 4 months' time, so around the middle of August. And then importantly, beyond the end of our financial year, which is June, so June 30 is our financial year, organisations will have 3 months to start reporting to the government about the status of these programs. So have they done the personnel screening? Have they assessed the risks? Have they put in risk mitigation plans? Have they developed resilience and continuity plans for impact to any of these critical assets and so on? So July to September is going to be a really critical period for organisations as well, where the first set of those reports need to be lodged and with the federal government. So in terms of what do we need to do now? I think there's really 3 key sort of steps, just at a sort of summary level. Organisations need to decide or determine if SOCI applies to them or not. We need to determine if what the requirements are and where the current gaps are and so on, and what is the plan to address those gaps. So in terms of looking at, does it apply? I mentioned previously, there are categories within each of those 11 industries. So you need to, as an organisation, if you haven't already done so, check to see, what those categories are. And I mentioned previously, for example, in freight, if you're an organisation which is shipping across borders in Australia, you fall under SOCI. If you're doing local sort of deliveries and so on, probably not. If you're a bank or a financial organisation, if your balance sheet or your trading activity is above a certain financial level, it falls under SOCI. If you're a smaller organisation, it doesn't. So again, understand if it actually applies to you or not. But even if it doesn't, I would urge organisations to keep their eye on the legislation and their growth plans, because you may well have business expansion plans that say, hey, we're doing this at the moment, but next year we're going to expand and we're going to grow into some new areas and so on. So you may well fall into SOCI or be required to comply with SOCI down the track at a later date. So worthwhile keeping an eye on your internal growth plans and business development plans and so on, and also any changes in the legislation. Once you've determined if it applies to you, then you need to look at your own internal risk management plans, governance processes, compliance, resilience, incident response, and really do effectively a detailed assessment of your organisation's practices and policies and procedures, and a gap analysis against what the legislation says versus what you're currently doing and where the gaps might be. Obviously, they need to be prioritised, and then obviously plans developed to remediate them. So some of it may be internally remediated, some you might need external assistance, from external organisations. And obviously then it's a matter of basically for the third parties basically together a roadmap to implement all of those changes. So if you haven't got the PSOs in place, if you haven't got the hazard plans in place, obviously we need a roadmap, resourcing and so on to actually build all of that out and put it into place.
A lot to do between now and August, it seems. So hopefully our audience has, their pen and paper out and they're writing these dates down and everything that needs to be done. But Rod, I appreciate your advice to organizations that may not fall into this right now, just to keep a pulse check on what is going on for future expansion. I think that's critical, for everyone out there. I want to take a quick moment. Oh yeah, sure.
I was just going to say, look, so when dealing with these things, as I said, legislation can be a bit overwhelming, right? Very happy for anyone to reach out for conversations. Yeah. I know people have background screening in place, and the call out is not necessarily, I don't expect you to be changing background screening providers, but we do work in this space, and I'm happy to have conversations with anyone. Don't expect you to start running RFPs to change providers, but love catching up with people, talking about our experience, how we're implementing this for existing clients. No strings attached. So please reach out. Let's have a conversation and talk about what we're doing.
Of course. Much appreciated there, Mick, for sure. So live viewers, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, final call for any questions that you may have, pop them in the comment section. As we wait for any final questions to come through, I just wanted to grab some quick, final thoughts from the two of you on today's episode, on the legislation, anything you just want to leave our audience with quickly. So Rod, I'll come to you first, but just any final thoughts you may have.
Yeah, look, I think it's overall, I think this is a really positive thing for the country. I think that's really important to say. A lot of people look at legislation and compliance as a significant overhead, and particularly in the cyberspace. Obviously, this is just every day, everywhere around the world. You open up the paper, you turn on the news, and there's another attack somewhere, etc. So I think it's a really positive initiative that the government's taken to step up these measures. There are also a couple of other things I just didn't mention earlier, just around there's some increased assistance from the government. So the Australian federal government is also offering to assist people that do have breaches and do need assistance in these areas as well. So if you are subject to an attack, there's a whole series of now measures and so on. So there is a lot of support out there. So again, as Mick mentioned, it can look overwhelming and people can say, oh, it's another legislative thing. But I hope organisations take away from all this that it's a really positive thing. It's going to enhance the country's, resilience, risk mitigation, and so on. And organisations should really look at it in that sort of vein, rather than, hey, just another whole sort of, whole other thing we need to comply with, and see it as a as a grudge purchase, as that were. Yeah.
I think that's important to leave our audience with, for sure.
Mm.
Mick, any final thoughts from you?
You won't be surprised to hear me say that personnel risk is really up there, high in the charts. But for me, knowing your candidate or your employee, a digital identification is essential, right? So you know that person, you know that is the person you're dealing with. And then, your point in time check, having the right level of risk mitigated, but you need to know that person on an ongoing basis. We're not talking about everybody in the organization. We're talking about high risk roles with people with access to critical infrastructure. It's your responsibility. The cost associated with doing those checks is absolutely minimal. The cost of not doing them is catastrophic. So for me, personnel risk is really, really important.
Of course. So we went over a ton of critical and timely information today on this episode of Sterling Live. I want to let our audience know that we have a ton of, material on this legislation. We have a ton of material from both Sterling and OpsCentre on our partnership, on what we're addressing around the legislation, on just the company overviews and everything like that. So I am requesting that if you would like this information or for further information, as always, you can visit both of our websites. But raise your hand, reach out to Rod and Mick on LinkedIn. You can reach out to the Sterling corporate LinkedIn as well. There's an inbox on there that you can message if you need further information. If you want these assets, if you want to just talk more, please do raise your hand, reach out. I know, Mick, you had mentioned it before. Love to have conversations, with those, who are working through this right now. So just wanted to give that final call out to our audience. But again, very timely and important episode with a lot of information. So Mick and Rod, I'd like to thank you both for providing everything today. Very, very helpful. And as always, I'd like to thank our audience, whether you're tuning in live right now or watching the on-demand version. We appreciate you coming to Sterling Live every episode. So with that is what we've had today. We do have another Sterling Live episode this week. I will catch you guys on the 25th. That is our next episode. But again, Mick, Rod, thank you so much for joining me on this episode.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, for moderating.
Of course. I will catch everyone on the next episode. And yes, thank you again.